Chapter 336. I spent the entire first week reading and memorizing all the information available to me about the structure and functioning of the human body and on training with transfiguration and some of the old combat spells. But I only brought them up to the point of creating a magical circuit but did not activate them. I did not want to damage the hall, and it is not a fact that the activation of such quite powerful and destruction-oriented spells will go unnoticed. Rowena came up with a way to additionally load my brains. She simply starts moving through the shadows in the form of an architect and transfigures something all the time, from the smallest and insignificant operations to manipulations with a large volume of space. It would seem that she's just playing around, but no. She's forcibly distributing the load between consciousnesses, allowing me to feel and participate in all of these magical manipulations. This significantly loaded the brain and allowed me to deeply understand the essence of such a mixture of the transfiguration of matter and space. The lessons were going quite normally, in the usual and familiar way. In the Dada class, the Gryffindors tempered their ardor. Although without enthusiasm, they were engaged in theory, even if it was too difficult for them. A possible reason, it seems to me, is the dryness of the text in the textbook. It perfectly conveys the theory, but the presentation is too much for adults, for those who are able to wade through boring texts and wording. This is all not surprising, as is the lack of really good teachers. There is no institute of teaching in magical England, as in many other magical states, and the reason may lie both in the mentality and simply in the small number of wizards per unit area. For same England, Hogwarts is enough, and in some cases personal mentors, who, by the way, are also not teachers, but simply qualified wizards. Harry and Ron enlisted the support of the twins, who even pushed aside their experiments with strike breakfasts a little, stubbornly, and surprisingly, quite quietly, spread rumors about the gathering of a group for classes on Dada. Harry also did not forget about his punishments every day. At 5 in the evening, he regularly went to Umbridge's office and returned with an inflamed back of the palm of his right hand. Well, if a guy can't live in peace, so be it, as they say. Why did I even bring up this idea of organizing a group? Well, it's simple. This idea was implemented only in the winter in the Potter tale, if my memory of a past life serves me correctly. That said, it was far from Potter's own idea. Now that he doesn't have the best witch of this generation on his team, he might not think of it. A group of like-minded people will not gather. If the Dark Lord decides to lure Potter to the Ministry by a similar method, then Potter will most likely die there. And if not, Voldemort will receive a prophecy, and Potter and those who go with him will be decently crippled or even killed. So everything is in favor of the Dark Lord, except I don't like him, and everything that's good for him is bad for me. And now that I have given an idea, the group can gather much earlier. They can learn more, or at least they will use spells more confidently. However, there is also a theoretical disadvantage. As I see it, in the Potter tale, in the battle in the Department of Mysteries, the Death Eaters were just playing with kids, and it is not known how everything will turn out if these children are more qualified. In general, I again enthusiastically plunged into training without any mercy for myself and for Hermione. The girl, who had finally realized that the Dark Lord had been reborn, who had read and listened to stories about his and the Death Eaters' past atrocities, brewed restoring potion complexes and practiced until she collapsed without strength. Also, when she did, she would drink potions and move forward to her accomplishments again. We chipped in for the ingredients, so it wasn't a problem, and the twins, for a modest reward, managed to get something that can't be ordered openly. The only disadvantage of such training under doping is that you need to give your body a rest and remove toxic elements from potions. 2 months of training with potions and a month without them, rehabilitation. But the effect promises to be great because even if our memory is perfect, our reflexes are not developed much faster. That's where the potions come to the rescue. Chapter 337. When on Friday of the first week, in our tent in the middle of the secret room, I decided to help the girl with potions, I was driven away from them in a very strict manner. No, 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 the girl shook her head, moving away from the two large cauldrons in which she was brewing 3 different compositions. She looked quite aggressive, slightly disheveled hair, rolled up sleeves, a stern look. Why I make potions? Well, we do it for ourselves. Hermione adjusted a small enchanted hairpin in her hair, which did not allow the hair to fall out and get into the potion, and the potion vapors to settle on her hair. Here, you need to brew potions perfectly and not drink if there is nothing left to lose. You don't have a high opinion of my potions. It's just that I can make them perfectly, so why waste time? And after reading so many different books and handbooks, I'm no longer the first-year student who will blindly follow the recipe and, I don't know, cut nuts, not crush them. Yes, an understanding has come along lately. You, Max, manage to make absurd combinations of runes in arithmancy as if they should be like that. It's simple, I shrugged. So it's simple to me in potions. So let's spend our time rationally. Actually, after that, I did not participate in the process of preparing potions, doing what I do well. At least I have enough knowledge for potions classes. On Saturday morning, after the traditional jog and other physical exercises, we cleaned up and went on a trip to Hogsmeade in school uniforms and robes, where Lady Greengrass was supposed to be waiting for us. Getting out of the castle, as always, was quite simple. Complex spells of concealment and disguise, and now we are safely crossing the castle gates, and in a few minutes, we reach the village itself with a leisurely step. The weather was, like all the last days, quite overcast and gloomy. Still, I like it exactly like this, and the view of the Forbidden Forest and the surrounding mountains, painted with vegetation in rather dark shades of green, evokes a sense of mysticism. The locals go about their business at this time, and in most cases, as I understand it, it's in the ministry. In fact, few people in Hogsmeade keep shops because they are only useful on the days of permitted trips for students. But that doesn't mean that at other times there aren't students who can get out of the castle. And it's worth noting that the Hogwarts Express runs all over England during non-school hours, carrying goods and cargo that are easier and more profitable to deliver that way. Some cannot be reduced, some cannot be put in the bag with extension charms, and some are too big. It happens all together. In general, it is quite common to see visiting wizards, but they are mostly content with a cafe on the platform. We were on our way to the Three Broomsticks, which I was glad of because Delphine could have chosen the farthest place that stood in the middle of nowhere for the sake of secrecy. The Hog's Head, run by none other than Aberforth Dumbledore. However, this is rarely mentioned anywhere, so I will pretend that I don't know anything. But, for now, let's put aside our thoughts about this large and strange stone building on the outskirts. We entered the Three Broomsticks, a pleasantly light pub that boasted a simple but well-maintained wood finish in light colors, and moved toward the far table, which was occupied by one of the few customers. Lady Greengrass was dressed in a formal blue dress and a navy blue robe with a hood that had now been removed, revealing a thick braid of almost white hair slung over her shoulder. "Good morning," I said with a smile as we got closer. My sense of magic told me it was Delphine, though something subtly changed in her. "Hello," Hermione gave a respectful but not a deep bow. It seems that she liked Delphine. "Good morning to you, too," Lady Greengrass smiled and gestured to the empty chairs at the table. "Have a seat." Chapter 338. As soon as we sat down, Delphine immediately got down to business. So, regarding classes, since you can practice performing transfiguration tasks yourself, I have prepared a list of literature that may be useful and which is available in the school library. If there are any questions, we will discuss them in class once a week. In the classes themselves, we will move on to the theoretical study of healing magic. Hermione straightened, listening carefully. Did you pick up the literature on the topics that I asked for? Yes, I nodded. And learned it. That's great. Would it be difficult for you to make copies and send them to me? I would like to know if there is something new in this area for ordinary people. I don't want to go to the guild for this. There are people too, and they are not averse to earning extra money on recluses. Okay. And give Hermione copies. Delphine turned her gaze to the girl. You wouldn't mind participating in the next stages of training, would you? Of course not. I will be glad to participate. That's wonderful, Delphine smiled. But I don't quite understand. Hermione hesitated a little. Why would you bother with me even though I am not your student? Oh, it's simple here. You will reach a certain level of knowledge and strength, and Max, after receiving the status of a master, will take you as an apprentice, and in a month or two, you will already defend this title. And what about you? A reasonable question came out of the girl's mouth by itself. I won't need another student. Moreover, you do not burden me and even help in the training of this young man. Hermione nodded, understanding the meaning and point of Delphine's idea. Now, about the classes themselves. I can't say exactly how long we will study only theory. After all, you are very capable in this regard. But, since only the theory will go, then we can quite well be right here and not rush anywhere. How good is your auditory memory? It's as good as with books, I shrugged. Likewise, Hermione looked at Lady Greengrass and at me. But only if I concentrate a little. Great. But for some things, you still have to make notes. So, let's start right now. We took out our notebooks and fountain pens, and Delphine took out her wand and swiped it around the table, casting a muffling spell. So we don't disturb anyone, and we don't get distracted. Okay, so. Healing magic is not a discipline you can learn from books alone. You can learn a lot of spells, potions, and rituals, but that's not what healing magic is all about. Its essence is in a deep understanding of magical, namely magical functioning of a human body or another patient. In our time, there is an adaptation of Muggle knowledge in this field, and many established dogmas have to be either supplemented or radically reconsidered. But today and tomorrow, we'll only touch on the general nuances, and next week I expect you to have in your bright minds the whole pile of knowledge that Max, as always, carries in his shoulder bag. Hermione and I looked at each other and turned our attention back to Lady Greengrass. It is worth saying what a healer should know and be able to do. Many people think that one becomes a qualified healer by learning a myriad of spells and counterspells, but this is not true. You need to know how the body functions, every system in general, organs and tissues in particular. You need to know what processes go on in the body in norm and in pathology. In today's world, you need to know how tissue cells are organized and how they function. One needs to know what role magic plays in all this. But that's not all. A really good healer, and not just a nurse, must be able not only to use diagnostic spells and rituals, but also be able to interpret the data obtained from them. Since they themselves will not tell where, what and for what reason the patient is in pain. It is necessary to be able to predict the influence of various magical impacts on the patient's body, systems, organs, and magic, to be able to construct an individual picture of the interrelation of all these systems among themselves in order to determine the source of the illness or curse and to calculate the necessary treatment and its consequences. But most importantly, Chapter 339. Delphine held out a dramatic pause, and Hermione straightened up again, preparing to hear something very important. A high-ranking healer is required to know blood magic, necromancy, and dark magic at the level of at least an apprentice, and more importantly, to be able to use it. Oh! Hermione was somewhat surprised. What did you expect? Delphine looked at us with a chuckle. You can't cure a patient without knowing the magic used. You can relieve the symptoms, you can stop a disease or curse, but you can't cure it. Undoubtedly, the greatest and most talented healers manage without this knowledge, using only the deepest understanding of the principles of the body and the ability to put it in order without regard to all cause and effect relations. But there are only a few of them, and not in England, but in the world, and they have been coming to this level for decades and even more. You should not hope for your own great uniqueness but should learn all that is necessary. This knowledge, along with the ability to apply it, by the way, is one of the reasons why official healers are left alone. Can I ask you a question? Hermione even tried to raise her hand but stopped herself, causing a slight smile and a nod from Delphine. Are you officially a member of the guild? If I understand the meaning of your message correctly, yes and no. I have a valid membership in an international guild, but at the same time, I am exempt from oaths as a non-practicing healer. Oaths? No harm, except in cases of self-defense. Exactly. And how deep is your knowledge in the disciplines related to healing magic? Sufficient for a master healer, but no more. Such knowledge is hard to get, and practicing it disgusts me as a fighter and a healer. If the need has come to inflict injuries incompatible with life, then achieve these goals with one powerful and accurate blow. Do not try to get the brain through one place, simultaneously turning the enemy inside out. And since we have touched on this topic, it will be useful for you, Max, to know and understand that one of the important problems of fighters follows from this. It is difficult for us with half measures. Some people even divide us into 3 types. Don't you want to guess which ones? Hermione thought about it, and I used the obvious classification from computer games, which, to my great regret, there are not very many in their good performance yet. Well, at least for me. I think, I looked at both ladies in turn. Something defensive type, offensive type, and something like assassin type. Delphine looked at me thoughtfully and even tilted her head to the side. You're right. The names vary from country to country, but that's the gist of it. Because of the disciplines I've become a master of, I pass under that classification as a battle mage specializing in defense. But it's all really just guild bureaucracy to make distributing tasks in any gatherings or joint operations easier. That doesn't mean that defender can't attack and an attacker can't defend. It seems that everything is not so simple. Hermione nodded. How else could it be? It's at school that everyone is a student and nominally everyone is equal. But outside of Hogwarts, things are much more complicated. Let the world of wizards be incomparably smaller than that of ordinary people. However, it is no less diverse, and in some regions, there are still innumerable works on the research of this very world and the magical heritage of antiquity. Anyway, we have gone a little off topic. Let's begin to look at everything in more detail. The 2 weekends of my first week at Hogwarts were not at all in weekend mode. We spent the mornings and evenings at the 3 Broomsticks, listening to summaries of healing magic and the mandatory areas of blood magic, dark magic, and necromancy. We have already learned some in the restricted section, but there were often methods of purely practical use. Still, according to Delphine, the basis of these sciences should be looked for in the libraries of other families, but the whole problem is that knowledge is not shared. For most old families, this knowledge is their bread and butter, their specialty. Of course, no one will voluntarily share this. You can also get this knowledge in the relevant guilds, but there are also oaths, restrictions, contracts, donations, and the guilds themselves, as organizations often international, in order to pursue their interests may well send you to the ass of the world, not for a thank you, of course, but not everyone likes that. So it turns out that it is very difficult to be self-taught and not to kill yourself in the process of reinventing the bicycle. Chapter 340. In the second week of training, Hermione picked up a pile of books on anatomy, physiology, and other disciplines, swallowing the information like some superscanner. This is all the experience of working in the restricted section, where some books you wanted to memorize and put aside as soon as possible, and only then do comprehension. Harry, Ron, and the twins were actively looking for supporters to join the group. As I realized from all this fuss, some Gryffindors from the 4th, 5th, 6th, and even 7th year had already joined them. Already, through them and their acquaintances, were spreading the word to other houses. Hermione and I were constantly busy studying and practicing, returning to the common room often after lights out and no longer sitting on the couch, but half alive going to wash up and sleep. So the second week passed, the third, October came, and it became noticeably colder outside. The rare daytime sun was no longer so high in the sky, its rays were no longer so warm, and the nature around gradually acquired darker and darker shades. It was only in the middle of October that the unnamed Society for the Secret Study of Magic decided to get together and solve organizational issues. Many, as I understood, did not even know yet how many of them would gather from all houses except Slytherin. The meeting was scheduled, surprisingly, in the Hog's Head. Conspirators, damn it! The most obvious place to gather as a group and break the rules by prior agreement. Even Hermione and I were invited, and we even agreed. And all because of Lavender, Parvati, Seamus, and Dean, who somehow joined our company in an unknown way. It's not that we communicate a lot, but somehow it just happened. We are so different, sit next to each other in classes, large hall, and common room. So it turned out that when everyone involved was invited to the meeting, the guys looked at each other and told us, "Let's go have a look and listen. If anything, we'll leave." There was one moment that bothered me about the whole situation at Hogwarts. Since mid-September, Dumbledore has stopped appearing at meals, occasionally flashing here and there at other times. At the same time, he looked extremely worried. I puzzled over this question for quite a long time, until one evening, the day before the scheduled meeting of the Nameless Order, right after dinner, Professor Snape intercepted me on the way out. "Mr. Knight, Miss Granger," he nodded, for we did not have his class today and had not yet said hello. As soon as we nodded back, the professor continued, "The headmaster would like to see you, Mr. Knight, in his office. Now, follow me." Snape turned abruptly, in his manner, and we followed. "The Gryffindor common room is on the way." "Do you think something's wrong?" she asked with well-hidden concern. "Are you worried about the headmaster?" "I'm worried about us. He rarely looks worried." "Really worried?" "Maybe something happened to him, or the ministry pressured him. It could affect all of us." We reached the flight of stairs, where Hermione went one way, into the common room, and the professor and I went the other. "I'll wait in the common room." I nodded back and followed Snape. It didn't take us long to walk through the dimly torch-lit stone corridors. When we reached the niche with the gargoyle, we didn't find it and immediately stepped into the spiral staircase, going up. The headmaster's office was illuminated only by the light of the stars and by the gleam of extracted thoughts in the pensieve, repeatedly reflected from the mirrored walls of the cabinet in which it was built. This light was enough to distinguish not only the outlines but everything else. In his chair sat the headmaster, and the moon, suddenly and so just in time, came out from behind the clouds and colored the office blue-black. The blackened right hand of the headmaster was perfectly visible against this background. "Ah, Severus, Max, come in." It was unusual to hear the absence of Mr. in Dumbledore's speech. But his voice was still firm and strong, though not without a hint of fatigue. "Come in." Dumbledore spun around in his chair so that we could approach him from the right, just to his hand. "Max." "Mr. Knight," the headmaster corrected himself and looked over his half-frame glasses into my eyes. "I would like to ask you to examine my arm." Professor Snape muttered something quietly behind my back, and it was clearly not approving. "Severus has already given his opinion, but I would like your opinion as well." The headmaster stretched out his hand, placing it on the table, and now I could see it. It was black like it was charred. There was strange and unpleasant magic that was spreading through the old man's body. I took out my wand and began to move it over the headmaster's hand, releasing unstructured magic and listening for reactions. Actually, there was no reaction. Then I cast a simple diagnostic spell, then a more complex one, and then an even more complex one. It's amazing how Voldemort could cast such an incredible curse. I recognized about a third, so to speak, of the elements in it, similar to the description in the rather ancient scrolls from both the restricted section and the library at Grimmauld Place, which had something like that. But the rest. Chapter 341. An incredible self-made curse, I said quietly, continuing to complicate the diagnostic charms. "I'm not an expert, but the curse is quite nasty and complicated." It penetrated instantly and immediately throughout the entire triad. It seems that it even touched the soul a little, but you, apparently, stopped this process yourself at the very beginning. "You're right," the headmaster nodded. "That's the only thing I could do." Professor Snape brewed a potion to stop the process. "It's not a panacea," came Snape's quiet voice, but the very subtle nuances of the voice spoke of hidden irritation and even anger. "You have acted as recklessly as possible." Later, Severus, Dumbledore shifted his tired gaze to the potion's master, and he fell silent. "A very powerful, complex curse," I continued to speak. "It appears to have merged very organically with you, triggering processes of change in the body on all levels. It diverges cyclically, stage by stage, starting from a place of contact with something." Putting the wand back into the holster on my forearm, I looked carefully at the headmaster. "Have you contacted other specialists?" "Of course, Mr. Knight. Very high-class ones. Although my fame as the Great Light Wizard has a downside. Not every dark wizard will agree to meet with you." "Yes." The healers expressed their opinion. So did Severus. "What say you?" "With the current progression of development and the spread of the curse, no longer than a year." Dumbledore nodded in agreement. "I told you so," Professor Snape said again. "Not now, Severus. Let me have a word with Mr. Knight alone." Snape stood there for a few seconds, glaring at both of us. "I'll be in my office," he said sharply, then turned and left. The headmaster leaned back in his chair, relaxed, and was quiet for a dozen seconds. "You must be wondering how I managed to find myself in such an unseemly situation. I would be lying if I said no." Dumbledore pointed with one glance to the chair across from his desk, in which I immediately sat down. Remember last year, your mentor narrated the essence of an object. Horcrux, I nodded. Exactly. Voldemort's Horcrux. Tom Riddle's. It was only then that I realized what exactly the reason for his immortality was. I couldn't even think. I don't think anyone could. But the question arose, how did a piece of Voldemort's soul get into Harry? A long search for information led me to some disappointing conclusions. It could only happen to a wizard from an Avada hit if his soul was split multiple times. But how many? That question remains open for now. The headmaster turned his head toward the window, looking out at the moon. Long searches, memories, analysis. They led me to one of the Horcruxes, but the defenses proved too cunning and strong, and together with the object. The headmaster looked at me. Do you believe in fairy tales, Mr. Knight? I believe, headmaster, that there is no smoke without fire. Dumbledore smiled into his beard, opened his locker, and took out a ring with a black stone. The Gaunt family ring. It is the lineage to which Tom Riddle belongs. After the Horcrux was created from it, it ceased to have value as an ancestral ring, but the stone. Have you read the tales of Beetle the Bard? The Resurrection Stone? Yes. That's exactly what it is. Every person, Mr. Knight, accumulates a load of mistakes and regrets with age. Some are insignificant, while others torment him until death. The magic of the Horcrux, the knowledge of the essence of the stone. They were stronger. It was the ring that had that curse. Dumbledore straightened up in his chair, taking a more serious pose. At the moment, the Horcrux in this ring has been destroyed. That's good, I guess. But tell me, headmaster, why are you telling me this? The reason is simple, Mr. Knight. Harry Potter. Mr. Potter has an extremely difficult fate, partly through my fault. But far worse than that is what lies ahead for him. There are reasons, irresistible reasons, why he must fight the Dark Lord and prevail. Or not. Irresistible reasons. Yes. That cannot be changed. Prophecy, true prophecy, am I right? I didn't want to tell you that. If you didn't want to, you wouldn't have said irresistible. Only a true prophecy heard by someone can make any reasons irresistible. Yes, you are right, Mr. Knight. Over the summer, I was able to reach out to the Necromancer Lodge to discuss Mr. Potter's problem. Extracting a Horcrux from a living person after all these years is absolutely impossible. Mr. Potter has a chance of survival only if he dies voluntarily from Tom's Avada. But in the future, it will be Harry who will have to defeat Tom if he survives. And if he doesn't, there will be no one to defeat Tom. He will lead England to disaster, but none of the powerful will intervene until it's too late. I am sure that Tom, coming to power, will sooner or later bring the world to the verge of a new war, but not such as they were in the past. A war between wizards and ordinary people. Chapter 342. The headmaster was silent for a while, looking at me. I know that you, Mr. Knight, will not unnecessarily interfere in such things, but I also know that you want to comprehend magic in its most extreme forms. I would like to ask you to help Mr. Potter when it comes to business, no matter how it sounds. In addition to the fact that it is beneficial to you, I will also provide you with a service that, believe me, is difficult to overestimate. What service, may I ask? I'm going to introduce you to a wizard you can hardly ever reach. If you can persuade him to teach you, believe me, he will teach you what no one else knows. You've intrigued me, headmaster. I have no other choice. Absolutely no one from the powerful of this world, and not very strong, does not want and will not help England and us in solving the brewing conflict. Wizards have been living in enclaves for a long time, and the bubbling cauldron in the neighboring enclave does not interest them exactly until it promises to thoroughly splash them. I have to think about it, headmaster. Don't get me wrong, but I don't consider myself incapable of comprehending knowledge on my own. I understand, Dumbledore smiled. I'm like that myself. But, as my friend once told me, the stockpile does not pull the pocket. But at what cost does that stockpile come? What are the risks? Our whole life is a risk. The only question is, for what purposes are we taking risks? We can't change the world at the snap of our fingers, but we can keep it from getting worse. Think about it, Mr. Knight, but know that I will not reproach you in any way if you refuse. We nodded to each other, and I went to the Gryffindor's common room. Maybe there really is something to think about. The offer is interesting, and I don't like Voldemort either. He and his Death Eaters still need to be dealt with. The next morning, after talking to the headmaster, Hermione and I went to the Hog's Head. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I had asked Lady Greengrass to reschedule classes for a couple of hours in advance. The place, both inside and out, was untrustworthy. It was gloomy and desolate. Outside, hanging over the door, was a ruined sign with a picture of a severed hog's head, with drops of blood dripping from it. Inside, there was not a pungent but a noticeable animal smell, and the tables, like the walls, were old and blackened with time. It turned out that we came a little earlier than the others, so we took the far table, and I hid us with magic from the eyes of other people. The big bearded man behind the bar only grunted unhappily but didn't say a word against it. After a few minutes, other students began to arrive, and soon there were 20 people, no less. Harry and Ron, the ones responsible for the festivities, showed up, too. They were the ones who were given the floor, and at first, they were hesitant, but after a couple of minutes, they were bravely talking about the need to study and so on. When it came to the question of who would teach them, someone suggested Harry as a candidate and said, he had already fought the Dark Lord. Having agreed on that, the boys moved on to organizational matters. It was decided to keep the gathering secret through a contract, and Susan Bones from Hufflepuff suggested this option. No wonder, since her aunt is the head of the DMLE and she knows such nuances. They decided to keep in touch with the help of protean charms, and the idea was given by Cho Chang to notebooks work on these charms, through which she corresponds with Cedric. So it turns out that the means chosen were still the same. The guys began to enthusiastically draw up a contract and sign it. They named their group, What Idiots, Dumbledore's Army. Several people from Hufflepuff doubted whether they needed it at all, but under the pressure of the public masses, they still signed it. When the signatures were done, everyone gathered around Potter, and the obvious question sounded, where are we going to study? Max promised to show the room, Ron answered with a satisfied face. Max, one of the Ravenclaws, asked. Where is he, by the way? Yes. The twins said in unison. Hermione and I stood up from the table in sync, and our disguises fell off. It was hard to see us, though. We were both in black, our robes black, our gloves black. It looked like Hermione was beginning to fall in love with the practicality of that color. You guys are funny, I smiled at the crowd, who flinched and turned sharply at our appearance. Why the fuck did you call yourselves Dumbledore's Army, and if you get found out, what will the Ministry think? Okay, someone 2 or 3 with us, I'll show you the room. There's no need for a whole crowd to be wandering around the castle. Hey, I don't get it. Resented Ernie Macmillan. Why didn't these guys sign? Judging by the indignant murmurings, they agreed with him. I don't want to, I shrugged and looked at Hermione. Do you? What am I, stupid or something, to sign all sorts of weird contracts? The crowd rumbled again, and someone even jumped out of that crowd. Oh, Anthony Goldstein. But we all signed. What if you go and turn us into umbrage? What's the point? I smiled. What's there to argue about? Some of the older guys stood up from their seats. There are a lot of us here. 1 minute and we have the signatures. You better try. Chapter 343. Just a few of the boys decided to take out their wands. Suddenly there was a loud thud as Aberforth, the tall, powerful, bearded old man at the bar, banged his fist on it. No fighting in my pub. Is that clear? He bellowed in a loud, booming bass, and everyone calmed down. After looking at the guys, I spoke. Chong, Bones, Potter, follow me. Then you'll show and tell your houses who needs to know. Hermione and I got out of the Hog's Head, and the designated guys caught up with us only after a dozen meters. We walked at a fast pace, and the guys quickly lost their breath, which I considered only a plus. They were silent. We returned to the castle by one of the secret passages, and at a rapid pace, we went to the 8th floor. When we reached the right place, I pointed to a painting of trolls in ballet tutus. Opposite this picture, you must walk 3 times, keeping in mind the thoughts of the desired room, sincerely, earnestly wishing for the appearance of this place. In our case, the wording is, I really need a spacious place for training and practicing magic. Who will try it? Potter immediately stepped forward, stood, thought, and began walking back and forth. For the 3rd time, a large double wooden door with black iron monograms began to appear in the wall opposite the painting. Open it, I nodded to the guy, and he boldly pulled the door open with a ring. When we walked into the room that opened, we immediately began to explore this really spacious and bright room with mirrors in the walls, bookcases, sofas, armchairs, and cushions. There were a couple of tables and benches. In the far corner stood unsightly mannequins on wheels, vaguely resembling people. Just gorgeous! Exclaimed Susan Bones, excited and delighted. That's quite a pretty girl growing up, albeit a redhead. And a year and a half ago, she was, as they like to say, big-boned. What is this place? Asked Potter, looking around the room much more calmly. On the other hand, Hermione was already standing by the bookcases, glancing cursorily at the book covers. The Room of Requirement, also known as the Come and Go Room. It has many names. Appears, as I said, under certain conditions. Do you need to think hard about something? Pondered Potter. What if, for example, you want to go to the bathroom, a room full of chamber pots shows up? Ha, Harry! I smiled. Why is it that as something said in class, you can't remember, but as a portion of nonsense heard in your left ear at the ball, you memorize it right away? How so? Potter shrugged and smiled at his thoughts, and I walked over to Hermione. Find anything interesting? And nothing. She answered, not hiding her disappointment. It's all in the regular library. Not even the restricted section. The girl broke away from reading the covers of the books and looked at me with a question. Why haven't we been studying here? Although no, wait. How many people know about this room? You're thinking in exactly the right direction. I have no idea. It's risky. But only a few people know about our place, and only one can get in. I turned to the rest of the guys. All right, gentlemen. We're leaving. We've got things to do. And you can settle in here, ponder, study, tell the others. Sometimes Hermione and I will come in and read something, although it's all available in the regular library, but I looked over the books again. Here are the most orderly, useful, and informative books. In general, something like that. Thanks, Max. Harry walked over and held out his hand. You've really helped us out a lot. No problem, I shook his hand back. We don't use it anyway. And you're doing something useful. Just, please, don't piss off Umbridge. She really will take the soul out of us all through the ass. Potter smiled but inadvertently glanced at his hand. And here's another thing, I continued. The black quill is classified as a dark artifact, and its use is strictly regulated by law. Only and only for the purpose of signing documents, contracts, and treaties. Everything else, especially the compulsion to use it, is Azkaban. Think about how to use it. But it's better to hold it until the end. They don't linger on the position of Professor Dada these days. Potter didn't understand at first, but it came to him quickly, and he nodded again. It seems to be even with gratitude. Hermione and I left the room. It was time for Delphine's class. When are we going to get to blood magic already? I wonder what the wizards have invented and whether it is possible to use my hemomancy in this direction. Chapter 344. With the first days of November, you could see a thick blanket of frost in the yards in the mornings, and though it quickly faded, the weather was getting Scottish cold. Despite the fact that I was, in a way, the co-founder of Dumbledore's army, neither Hermione nor I went to those classes. We simply had no time for such nonsense. The slight interest in what are they doing there was gone almost immediately when we remembered the amount of material we had not yet studied. We started visiting the restricted section again, trying to finish it as quickly as possible. There wasn't much left. The reason for the rush was simple. We feared that Umbridge might get wind of this and forbid it for a completely understandable reason. This knowledge is not something that is acceptable for students, even not for every adult. On the first weekend in November, as always, Hermione and I went to the Three Broomsticks for another lecture by Lady Greengrass. As soon as we settled down at the already familiar table in the far corner of the establishment and cast various privacy charms around, I took the floor. I have a question. I'm listening, nodded Delphine seriously, this time dressed in a dark green dress and black robe. How much credence can one give to a prophecy uttered in front of witnesses? Hermione, who was sitting next to me, was also interested in the topic raised, though she glanced at me in surprise. Absolutely, Delphine replied seriously. I'm not very versed in this topic, but I can say for sure that a prophecy uttered in front of reasonable witnesses possessing magical powers will come true for sure and exactly as it is uttered. Possessing magical powers, clarified Hermione. Yes. That's right. If the witnesses were ordinary people, the prophecy has no power. Although it would be more correct to say that it can be neglected, events can be changed. According to the books, they were convinced of the truth of that statement in ancient times. Those oracles, Pythoness, and other gifted persons were kept in very good conditions, but only ordinary people were allowed in their environment. Surely one name is familiar to you, Michel de Nostradam. Nostradamus, we said simultaneously. Yes, smiled Lady Greengrass. An ordinary man, an alchemist's assistant, was fond of pharmacy. Little known fact, for 7 years, assisted the master alchemist in the treatment of one seer. As you can understand, the alchemist was not allowed to see the seer, so it was Nostradamus who took care of the patient. It was from him that he heard the prophecies, which, of course, he carefully wrote down and passed these notes to the wizards in charge. Why do you think none of the prophecies actually came true? There were no wizard witnesses. Exactly. However, prophecies uttered without witnesses will come true if nothing is done. Such prophecies are carefully documented, calculated, interpreted, and the events in them are prevented in advance. If they are bad, of course. True, it is often the bad prophecies. Why are you suddenly interested in such an abstract subject? It has come to my attention that there is a witnessed prophecy in which only one boy you know is capable of defeating you-know-who. I had to call Voldemort by that nickname, for there was no defense against taboo around. Interesting, Delphine pondered. However, without an accurate knowledge of the text of the prophecy, it is impossible to draw any conclusions. For example, it says that this particular boy should win, but this does not mean that the actions of all the others do not make sense. Maybe the boy just needs to strike the last blow or activate the final trap or something else, just a necessary action on his part. Makes sense, I pondered. What boy? Hermione shifted her gaze from me to Delphine. A secret. Glancing at Delphine, all I got was an indifferent shrug, saying, "You decide." Potter. Hermione thought for a moment, and after a couple of minutes, she smirked. "Then we're doomed," she shook her head with a smirk, which brought somewhat inappropriate smiles to our faces. After this conversation, we moved on to more important topics for us, namely, study. Chapter 345. When we returned from Hogsmeade, toward evening, we went to the common room, hoping for the usual atmosphere of light loitering in our house. And it was indeed lively, but it had tinges of discontent, of resentment. Sitting down on our couch and hugging Hermione, I turned to the guys who were sitting at the table next to us. "Yo, Seamus, what's the panic about?" The Irishman reached out with his hand to his head to ruffle his hair out of habit, but stumbling upon a crew cut, crossed his arms over his chest and leaned back in his chair. "Umbridge." "Succinct," I nodded. "Any more details?" "Ah," he waved away, and Lavender turned to me, curling a curly strand of blonde hair worryingly around her index finger. "Here's the thing," the blonde spoke up. "Umbridge issued her first decree, a ban on all kinds of clubs, groups, and other things. You should go to her for permission." "And why would she decree something?" Lavender looked at me with genuine surprise. "Well, she's the Hogwarts High Inquisitor from the Ministry." "Yes, since when?" Now everyone at the table, Seamus, Dean, Parvati, and Lavender, were all looking at me bewildered. "It's been like this for 2 weeks now," Lavender explained. "Don't you guys follow events in the castle at all? Umbridge has even inspected all the teachers already." Yet I shifted my gaze to Hermione, resting her head on my shoulder. "Did you know? Someone said something like that." The girl lazily answered, her face showing weariness. "Basically, I would be passed out by now, too, if it weren't for the hemomancy." "I've never seen her in class." "Damn it, Max!" resented Seamus. "Let it be known to you, there are other students studying at the school, and even on other courses. An incredible discovery, isn't it?" "Whoa, take it easy. We just got very deeply involved in our studies." "You don't have to be so negative," I smiled back. "Yeah, sorry," Seamus tried to ruffle his hair again. "Damn, what is it with my hair?" "You asked for it," Lavender shrugged, hiding a smile. "It's just," Seamus looked at me, "we're all nervous because of this decree. Now we can't get caught practicing, either." Angelina also snaps at everyone. "What's the problem there?" A Quidditch team falls under the definition of a club, a group, and what else was there? "Oh, it doesn't matter." Slytherins and Ravenclaws immediately approved the team. I see. And which of the teachers is she bothering? Seriously, just Trelawney? Poor Professor Trelawney. Lavender and Parvati immediately became sad. Everything in her class is so interesting. Sleep, for example, Seamus nodded, getting indignant looks from the two girls in return. Easy, Seamus, I smiled. You encroached on the sacred. You should know by now that most girls need various horoscopes, divination, dream interpretation, and other manipulations with divination like air. After sitting for a while longer, Hermione and I made the commander's decision to go to bed. Otherwise, there's a considerable risk of falling asleep right there, sitting, and that's uncomfortable. Also, Potter and Weasley were obviously waiting for the common room to be empty while only hanging out near the fireplace. Are they waiting for the news? Well, to hell with them. The second week of November is coming to an end. It had been snowing outside all day, slowly covering the surrounding area with a thin white layer before it could melt. Looking back and remembering past events for the umpteenth time, I am amazed at how quickly time flies when you are busy doing things. No, seriously. There are a lot of really interesting things going on at Hogwarts if you listen to the guys in the common room, but I simply have no time to not only participate in them but even to think about them. Studying, lecturing, practicing, developing my laser spell, thinking about different theories about prophecies and ways to circumvent them. It all piled up like a snowball, consumed and now rolls off a cliff, without a clue. However, right now, on the evening of Friday, the 10th of November, it's time for rehabilitation from Hermione's restoring potions, which means that we will have to take a little break from training, mainly leaning on theory. Having summed up exactly these results, the girl and I left the Chamber of Secrets and decided to go to the Room of Requirement, out of pure curiosity. Of course, we put a complex of concealing charms on ourselves beforehand. A couple of turns before we reached the right corridor, we stopped. "Are you sure they're there now?" whispered Hermione. We couldn't see each other ourselves, so we had to navigate by voice. Usually, when the two of us need to get somewhere in the castle, we either walk holding each other's hands or robes, or we make an appointment in advance. This was one of those times when we walked holding hands. It was a strange experience, by the way, a hand in my hand and no one around to see. Judging by their schedule, yes, I nodded, remembering that same schedule. After walking a little more down the corridors, we noticed a curious picture, Filch sitting on a stool opposite the place where the entrance to the Room of Requirement usually appears. Without thinking twice, I threw a stunning spell at him, and the old caretaker began to fall sideways. I held him carefully with my telekinesis and lowered him smoothly so that he would not crash on the stone floor. I put my strength for about 3 minutes of sleep, so I did not worry about the old man's health. No matter how nasty and disgusting he might be at times, my upbringing does not allow me to mock him. After walking around the troll picture 3 times and thinking about the need to get to the practice area where the boys were, I got to the door to the Room of Requirement, and together with Hermione, we stepped inside. Chapter 346. Still the same spacious room with cabinets, couches, armchairs, and tables, and one part of it was filled with students of different ages. They turned around at the sound of the doors opening, and we took off the spell of concealment. After recognizing us, some people at first stupidly blinked their eyes and probably tried to remember whether we had the right to be here. After making sure that we have, everyone returned to their business and divided into groups, continued to practice various spells. Hermione and I sat quietly on one of the couches so that we could see the whole room. The girl used a spell to bring a large book on advanced spells from one of the shelves, and leaning her head on my shoulder, she opened the book so that we could both read it. After a couple of minutes, I noticed that Hermione, like me, was peering out of the corner of her eye at the other students training. It was quite an amusing sight. They seemed to be having a lot of fun here. One group tries to use Expelliarmus on another, standing still, and then they switch roles. The guys in the other group practice on everything in the Reductor curse, Reducto. Another group looks at two students trying to use Stupefy. Another group tries their best to summon Patronus. Potter and a Ravenclaw guy, I think from the 7th year, are scurrying here and there. They give out valuable instructions, correcting, teaching, telling. Suddenly, the twins sat down on a nearby couch. "What's wrong, boys?" I found it necessary to ask. Hermione looked at them, too, waiting for an answer. The twins looked over in surprise. "Oh, right, you don't know what's going on." The first one nodded. "Now Umbridge herself can assign punishments, assign or revoke privileges, and stuff like that. Us and Harry got kicked off the Quidditch team." "Oh. Did you do something wrong?" asked Hermione sympathetically, fixing a strand of hair. "Punched Malfoy," the twins nodded together. "He's got a big mouth," the other one explained. "But Hagrid is back," smiled the first. "And that seems to be the only thing keeping our Harry from falling into despondency." Both twins clapped themselves on their knees in sync. "Okay." They stood up at the same time. "We've had enough rest." The twins quickly joined one of the groups and began to actively discuss and debate the nuances of spells. After a couple of minutes, Potter spotted us, and after giving a few valuable instructions to the other guys, he hurried over. "Max, we need to talk." Harry ruffled his already disheveled hair, and I waved my wand, surrounding us with a slightly vibrating, like hot air, dome that muffled sounds. Potter looked around the dome a little surprised, but once he understood its essence, he looked at me again. "Tell me, you train in the Chamber of Secrets, don't you? How do you come to that conclusion?" "It doesn't matter," Potter shook his head. "And what answer do you want to hear, and more importantly, why?" "I just don't understand." "You can only get in there if you can speak the language of snakes." "Oh, is that what you mean? And in general? About, how should I put it, the interest club, you know which one?" "No one tells me anything. I don't understand anything. What's going on at all?" Even Sirius is silent, obviously hiding something. "And I want to know. I have a right to know. After all, I'm the one Voldemort is after." I looked at Potter carefully. "Can you keep a secret?" "Of course. Do you think I can't keep my mouth shut?" "Well," I smiled, "that's not the point, but Umbridge would say no." "Then what's the point?" Harry looked very serious. "Do you master occlumency to tell you anything, and the rest of your friends, too?" "Occlumency?" Hermione closed her book and decided to insert a few words into the conversation. "The science of protecting and ordering the mind. Prevents others from reading your mind." "Even that's possible, I mean, mind reading?" Potter looked extremely surprised. "Exactly, Harry. Without that skill, your head is an open book. If someone suddenly has the skill of mind reading, it is easy to find out from you all the secrets of the club, plans, structure. You understand?" "And what should I do?" Hermione waved her wand and silently summoned a small old dark brown book from one of the shelves. "Read, learn, practice." It took us a year of daily practice to defend against superficial legilimency. But even this will not save you from a direct spell in the forehead. Chapter 347. Potter took the book and looked at it with a completely dumbfounded look. Having calmed down quite quickly after the information received earlier, Harry put the book on the table next to him and looked at us again. Okay, to Mordred, the Chamber of Secrets and Parseltongue. Why don't you study with us? I don't understand. You're the one who suggested all this, Max. Like I said, I'm just wondering where all this will lead to. Unbeknownst to Potter, I removed the silencing spell. What do you mean? Well, look, I got up from the couch. What are your goals, ultimate goals? To be able to protect ourselves. We already talked about that. Good goal, I nodded. A noble one. But let's simulate a situation. I looked at Hermione, but she clearly made it clear that she was much better off on the couch and with a book in her hands right now than on her feet and with her wand. Potter and I walked to the center of the room, and this maneuver didn't go unnoticed by the other students, who began to move slowly apart, forming a kind of semicircle. Some sat on cushions, others on benches. Some stood against the wall, like the twins, for example. For starters, I spoke, turning to Potter, who had his wand out. I also took out my own. One must be well aware that an adult wizard is no longer a student at school. Especially those who are on the side of the Dark Lord. They're either adult wizards from old families, or mercenaries, or scum off the street, or werewolves and things like that. Except that even street scum aren't harmless. The world is cruel and such people have felt it in full. They may not be fighters, but they'll be violent. Interestingly enough, everyone listened quite attentively, albeit without seriousness in their gaze. So, how might your encounter with an adult wizard go? I see two possibilities. The first is that he underestimates you and is just playing around like a cat with a mouse. He does not have a goal to kill you or particularly maim you, you just get in the way. I'll be that kind of wizard now. Quite slowly, I pointed my wand at Potter, and he reacted quickly. Expelliarmus. Harry waved his wand deftly, sending a quick dim grey blob at me. In a low whisper, I said, Protego reflecto, and with the tip of my wand, I caught the blob, sending it back at Harry. Potter's wand flew out of his hands. Stupefy, I whispered the spell again. A quick ray of the spell flew off the tip of my wand and hit Potter right in the stomach, knocking him back, at which point his wand flew into my hands. Incarcerus. And now he's tied up, too, so, I looked at the guys. This is the level of an average wizard. With a wave of my wand, I dispelled Incarcerus from Potter, setting him on his feet and returning his wand. Average, folks. Such, a sluggish wizard, neither fish nor meat. I can conjure even faster. Those from whom you want to protect yourselves, too. The Dark Lord's inner circle, I bet, can use short apparition, and I bet they can speed up with magic, getting even faster. They have experience against Aurors and DMLE. Now imagine that your enemy has taken you seriously and wants to kill you, not just brush you off like a fly. Potter prepared for another fight, and I arched an eyebrow in surprise. You want me to try to kill you? Harry thought, scratched the back of his head, and shook his head negatively. Our second problem is the same as what the DMLE and Aurors had at the time. Guess what? The students began to talk, discuss, but one blonde in a Ravenclaw uniform expressed a clever thought. Unforgivable curses. She said it quite loudly, and everyone else got quiet. Luna Lovegood, I think. Exactly. The problem is that we're limited in our spells. Not just in terms of knowledge but in terms of morality and legality. And the willingness to use them. Your enemies would have no such limitation. What do we have? Let me list them. Expelliarmus, stupefy, reducto, bombarda, evert statum, flipendo, expulso. With these, we can do some damage, respond with a blow to a blow. There's protego and variations of it. And then there's a bunch of everyday spells. There is such a Death Eater, Antonin Dolohov. He's a master at using everything to neutralize the enemy, including everyday spells. Before you can squeak, you'll find yourself hanging from the nearest tree by your own shoelaces. What are we supposed to do then? One of the Hufflepuffs indignantly asked. Anyone can talk. What if there are more of us? There are more of you now, aren't there? I held my arms out to my sides, and a few of the guys took out their wands and pointed them at me. Expelliarmus! One shouted. Stupefy! Shouted others. There were a few simple spells, too, designed to either disorient me, send my feet dancing, or hang me upside down. I simply spun around, beating the rays back with my wand like a sword, and when a dozen more students decided to join in, I simply operated with black smoke and launched reducto, creating a shockwave that knocked everyone to the ground. In a chaotic manner, I began to throw Incarcerus, oversaturated Stupefy and Expelliarmus at breakneck speed. From the outside, it might seem that the rays of spells from black smoke fly almost more often than sparks from a sparkler. 10 seconds and everyone around was already pretending to be caterpillars, being tightly bound with the help of Incarcerus. Chapter 348. When I returned to my place and emerged from the apparition, I examined this easy and painless beating. You'll say, we didn't expect it, sudden attack, incomprehensible possibilities. But that's exactly what's going to happen in the confrontation. Add to that the actual combat spells. With a flick of my wand, I began to remove Incarcerus from each of them until I freed them all. It took about 15 minutes for the students to clean themselves up, find their wands, and stop whispering indignantly. And what now? Asked a slightly despondent Potter. What's my point? The point is that you're out here having fun, learning the spells of the school curriculum, learning how to use them in a fun and relaxed atmosphere while your opponents stand quietly waiting. You're studying for exams, not for battles. I don't mean to brag, but Hermione and I have been practicing every bloody day since the first year, every bloody day, to the bloody sweat, so that I can now show you what you've seen. Tell them about the methods, came Hermione's voice, still sitting on the couch reading a book. Yes. Every practice was like the last time. We were trying to hit each other. Bruises, abrasions, cuts, hematomas, fractures, concussions. We brewed ourselves potions to keep from dying in our own training or from injuries. We studied everything we could get our hands on. Here, the seniors will not let me lie, there are a lot of books on dark and even black magic in the library. The girl and the guy from Ravenclaw's 7th year nodded when the others looked at them. I'm not scaring you. I just know what you can expect from those who don't limit themselves with morals and laws. If you say you want to learn how to defend yourself, then learn. Learn in a way that makes your brain boil and your wand fall out of your hands. It is not enough to gather once a week for an hour, for fun defense lessons. So, now what? Said Ron indignantly. Drop everything and be unable to defend ourselves. The guys nodded vigorously. Yes, indeed. You now need to learn something completely different. Not how to fight, but how to escape. Hey, we're not cowards. That's what they'll write on the tombstone. Harry. There are textbooks over there, I pointed to the bookcases with my hand. There are complexes of concealment and detection charms. Learn the disillusionment charms and the hominum revelio. I looked around at the students and found the girl I needed. Susan. Get the apparition practice rings and instructions through your aunt. The twins already know how to apparate. Let them teach you. Then, I noticed that someone had even started taking notes from dictation. I want everyone to learn Protego, Protego Maxima, Protego Reflecto. It is obligatory to be able to put Protego Maxima in a complex with Fientuduri and Repello Inimicum. You must be able to put them as a complex, around yourself, in a group of 3 people. Change groups periodically. With such a set of spells, you can go on the defensive, and only Avada, Fiend Fire, and Diabolica's Flame can break through them. Every group should have at least one student who is good at transfiguration that can make shields, walls, and other obstacles from Avada out of junk. If anyone suddenly thinks that defense is not enough, you can learn Sectum Sempra and the powerful Diffindo on dummies. Well, if you're ready to see your spell cut a man open and his guts fall to the ground. There were sounds of gagging from the particularly impressionable Max. Harry shook his head reproachfully. That's too cruel. How so? I clapped my hands. You're serious about confronting maniacs, murderers, rapists, and lunatics. You will threaten them with lumos and expelliarmus. Scared a hedgehog with a bare ass. Anyway, I've made my recommendations. It's up to you to follow them or not. But keep in mind that once you decide to fight, your life depends on this training. Do you devote enough time to this matter? Oh yes, learn cloaking charms as soon as possible. As I understand, this little club will soon be hunted. Why don't you teach us? Asked Ginny, peeking out from the crowd. No, I simply don't have time. The textbooks have absolutely everything. I learned from them, too. Only Protego requires a demonstration, but you've got the 7th year guys for that. I headed back to Hermione's couch, and the crowd of students began to break into groups again and actively discuss something. They quickly split into 2 teams in less than 2 minutes. Some are looking for books in the cabinets, and others are training. Those who found books began writing out spells and instructions and then multiplying parchments with them. It is unlikely that their fervor will last for a long time, but if they learn at least concealment charms and protective complexes, they may be able to hold out until the arrival of help if they get involved in some adventure. Chapter 349. For a brief moment, the thought of boredom ran through my head, and I pulled out the 2-way mirror that had been silent the whole time from the inside pocket of my robe. I tapped it with my wand and sent a signal to the other end. A minute, 2 minutes, and then Nymphadора's face appeared in the mirror. Hello, cousin, she smiled, changing her hair color from pink to purple. You haven't sent a message for a long time. Neither have you. Can you talk? Yes, but not for long. There's a lot of work to do, and the order takes up all my free time. I'm exhausted. Just like the rest of us. What's going on at the ministry? What's going on in general? What's going on here? There was feigned admiration on Nymphadора's face. The minister promotes the story of the madness of the headmaster and Potter in every possible way. The Aurors received an order forbidding them to teach defensive and attacking magic to relatives, students at Hogwarts. It's the same story at the DMLE. Bones is furious, but she can't do anything. Almost everyone suspected of having ties to the headmaster has been kicked out of their posts or suspended. Fudge is really afraid that the headmaster is recruiting and training his army at Hogwarts. You have no idea what rumors are circulating around the ministry. Any activity from the Dark Lord and the Death Eaters? Nothing at all. There is only suspicion. In the last 2 weeks, we've had 7 reports about missing Muggleborns and Half-Bloods. 7, max. In a year, Merlin forbid, 1 or 2 appear, and then usually after a week, it turns out that they were just drunk somewhere. The obliviators are out more often, and it's a big deal, but everyone keeps quiet, secrecy. What about the Muggle-borns? Unemployed or returnees? Half of them, you can almost definitely tell, just left the country quietly. But the 2 cases are pure missing with traces of magic. Tell your friends from the 2nd generation of wizards there in Hogwarts to write to their relatives so that they do not go to the magical world. It's all too unclear. I see. How are the others? How is Aunt Dromeda? She's fine. Mom is all about the work. Moody is bored out of his mind, he's been suspended. And in general a lot of work. There was suspicious activity in the Department of Mysteries several times. The alarm was triggered, but everything is clear. At least, according to the reports. I'm still in the junior ranks, so you know, they don't report. I see. So the Ministry is really afraid of children. I'm shocked myself. Smiled Nymphadora. Who's there to be afraid of? I remember, I passed the O.W.L.S. and the N.E.W.T almost with honors. I thought, a talent, a genius, I know everything. Aha! The Academy showed me very clearly that I was incompetent as a witch and even more so as a fighter. I think Fudge understands all this too, but through Umbridge, he's just trying to get you to frame Dumbledore. Okay, well, I have to go. Work. The image of Nymphadora in the mirror disappeared, and I tucked it away in my robe pocket. Good thing, Hermione spoke up, resting her head on my shoulder again, that we convinced my parents to leave. It's unlikely anyone would have touched them, but just in case. Right. As the saying goes, believe in Allah, but tie your camel. Interesting phrase. When it was time for Dumbledore's army to disperse, Hermione and I quietly cast a complex of concealing charms on ourselves and left the room of requirement. After taking the girl to the common room, I decided to visit the headmaster. However, my desires do not always coincide with the situation around, and the headmaster did not seem to be in place. But an owl flew to me right in the hallway. It was an ordinary owl, and judging by the pouch on its paw, it was from the post office. There was a small letter in the other paw. I moved my hand to the side so that the owl could use my forearm as a perch and waited for the winged messenger to land. I ran my hand over the letter, made sure there was no danger, took the package, and threw a sickle into the owl's pouch. The bird hooted contentedly and flew away. Honestly, I didn't think they could roam freely inside the castle, either. Although, just because I didn't see something, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. I opened the envelope with the familiar traces of Lady Greengrass's magic and pulled out a letter. I read it. Hey! I read it again. This is unexpected. Quickly went to the Gryffindor's common room. As soon as I went inside, I immediately found Hermione sitting on our couch and scribbling something in a notebook with great enthusiasm. She was so carried away that a little more and would have stuck out the tip of her tongue, biting it. My own, you know what? I sat down next to her. No, but I think I'm about to find out. Yet. There's no lecture with the mentor tomorrow. The girl turned her head sharply in my direction, looking with incomprehension and waiting for clarification. Tomorrow morning, Lady Greengrass and I are flying by Port Kea to Prague for the Transfiguration degree defense. My defense? Hermione looked extremely surprised. Ah! What about? You have to get your research papers published there beforehand. That's right, I nodded. According to her, there's some kind of reform, and I have to seize the moment. Now, or not until a year from now. Hermione immediately threw herself into a hug, smiling happily. Congratulations! Not yet. Tomorrow and the day after will be the result. Maybe I won't pass. Nonsense. The girl pulled away. Right. It's late. It's quite early, isn't it? No. You need to get enough sleep and be ready. Got it, got it. Good night. Don't stay up too late. You too. Hermione gave me a fleeting kiss on the lips, and I headed to my room to get ready for bed. It was all too sudden, and I don't like suddenness. Chapter 350. Saturday morning began with the physical exercises, but there was no desire to go outside. The snow was not freezing, but it interfered, as well as the mud underfoot. Just before I started my training session, I asked Rowena to optimize my knowledge of transfiguration, but not to isolate the thought process itself. This was a maneuver we hadn't done yet, and it turned out to be quite an interesting experience. It was like having poorly controlled thoughts when you try not to think about anything. Pictures, images, texts, and other information all seemed to go round and round in my head without my involvement, becoming more and more orderly little by little. Just before the training was over, I asked Rowena to try to transform a feature of the architect's transfiguration abilities into a kind of spell. This could be a good development and a topic for an article, in addition to the works planned back in August on combining the transfiguration of the living and non-living at the same time. A shower after a workout is an ordinary thing, without which it is difficult to imagine the beginning of my day. But before I went there, I asked Timmy, the house elf I knew, to make me breakfast for the trip. I don't know how things would turn out, and I don't like hunger, too much discomfort from it. In the room where the other guys were still asleep, I quickly checked to make sure I had everything in my usual bag with extension charm and made sure I was safe from any surprises with the equipment I had. I got dressed in my black three-piece suit, coat, and scarf, slung the bag over my shoulder, and left the room. Hermione was already sitting on our couch in the common room, and when she saw me, she immediately got up, came over, and hugged me. "Show them all," the girl said with a smile, not forgetting to give me a fleeting kiss on the lips, quickly pulling away. "You make it sound like I'm going to a fight, not an exam." "You never know," Hermione shrugged with a smile. "Okay, don't get bored here." I headed for the exit from the common room with a quick step, simultaneously applying complexes of concealing charms. Although it was still early in the morning, it was already possible to occasionally meet students and teachers hurrying about their business. The cool winter morning air pleasantly chilled the face, but unfortunately, the snow had already begun to melt, leaving behind a little dirt. On the one hand, I like the gloomy English climate, but on the other hand, it clearly lacks a normal winter, so that the sea of snow creaking under my feet, and in the morning, the air would ring from the frost. Everything here is gloomy and slimy, and the snow doesn't stay on for long in winter. Quickly reaching the Three Broomsticks, where there were almost no customers, and Madame Rosmerta was clearly conjuring something in the kitchen, I took off my disguise. I moved towards the far table, where, according to tradition, we were listening to Lady Greengrass's lectures. This time she was there too, in a long black dress and an elegant black coat, but, according to the tradition of wizards, with a hood. As I approached, I clearly felt by magic that it was Delphine, and judging by her look, which read recognition and some confirmation of this very recognition, Delphine is also not deprived of such a talent. "Lady Greengrass," I nodded courteously and smiled. "The contents of your letter surprised me greatly." "Mr. Knight," Delphine smiled and, fixing the thick braid of blonde hair on her shoulder, stood up from the table. I myself was caught off guard by the news from the guild, and much had to be organized in a hurry. "We don't have much time." Without waiting for my reply, Delphine headed for the exit, and I followed her. Just outside the threshold of the establishment, Delphine held out her hand to me, holding a simple silver chain. "Hold on tight." As soon as I took the chain and nodded in readiness, Delphine gave the verbal command, "Purchase," and we were whirled into spatial displacement, and judging by the speed, the portal was indeed intercontinental. After a while, we found ourselves on a spacious circular platform in the middle of a domed hall with frescoes on the ceiling. The lighting was not the best, only at human height, and it was problematic to see the frescoes. But the yellowish stone walls and columns going upward were clearly visible. We quickly walked toward the tall but narrow double-winged wooden doors with massive black metal brackets. Chapter 351. With a slight movement of her hand, Delphine pushed one of the doors, opening it. A spacious and high stone corridor without windows. Columns stretched the entire length, forming arches beneath the ceiling. Near each column stood pots of tall ornamental trees on either side, and on separate pedestals were stone knights in full ancient armor. Each knight stood straight, I would even say, proudly, leaning on the hilt of a large axe propped against the pedestal. I followed Delphine, who was purposefully moving along the corridor. Sometimes there were doors, turns, other halls that differed slightly either in shape, length, or design, and sometimes all at once. Several times we walked along the monumental and wide stairs, but we only moved down. And not a single window. A couple of times, we encountered wizards hurrying somewhere, dressed in all sorts of clothes, from a classic robe and a big hat to quite adequate and seemingly ordinary business suits and coats. Once, we met two elders in expensive grey robes but without frills. They were grumpily but quietly arguing with each other, paying no attention to anyone. "Lady Greengrass, may I ask you a question?" I turned to Delphine when we were already down 4 levels. "I was wondering when you would ask." "Where are we?" "Directly under the Church of St. Ignatius." Wow." I caught up with Delphine and caught a mocking look from her blue eyes, noticing a slight smile on her face. "I understand your confusion, Max. But we're in Prague. Believe me, everything here is not what it seems, and this city's magical and ordinary histories are so intertwined that you can't tell them apart. If you have time, and if you want to, you can visit a couple of interesting places, and believe me, you'll learn a lot. Like what I know that this church belonged to the Jesuits. It's all kind of weird," smiled Delphine again, looking at me. We stepped into another spacious high hall. This one was much brighter, with daylight pouring in from special niches under the ceiling. On both sides of the hall, there were real park areas with lush vegetation, trees, and bushes, and in some gazebos in the middle of these parks, elderly wizards sat and talked, drinking something in cups and eating fruit. "But we're definitely underground." Delphine slowed her pace slightly. "The church was built much earlier than common people think." "Yes, and its decoration was somewhat different. From the beginning, this place was an abode of knowledge, a home for wizards and witches who sought to comprehend the mysteries of the universe through transfiguration and alchemy. But when it finally became clear in the 17th century that the statute will be signed, the church was hidden away, as were many other things." We passed the group of wizards, exchanging polite nods, and headed for one of the next tall double doors. However, in Prague, as in many other significant cities in Europe, the lives and destinies of ordinary people and wizards were too closely intertwined, and, funnily enough, the further from Rome, the deeper those ties became. In general, although it is commonly believed that wizards are completely self-isolated, but in fact, all more or less influential structures are linked, exchanging information and solving various important issues. Religious institutions, the church, the governments of magical and ordinary states. Just a week later, an agreement was reached for cooperation between the Church and the Ordo Mysteria, or as it was then called, Ouroboros, now better known as the two guilds, Transfiguration Masters and Alchemists. Ouroboros, why so humble? You'll find out when you become a master. Damn, I'm intrigued. I thought alchemy came from potions. From any magical discipline, one way or another, you can come to another because they are all based on magic. Chapter 352. We left the hall, walking through it, and found ourselves in another corridor. But this time, the journey was rather short, and literally, the second door down this corridor was our goal. Once inside, we found ourselves in a spacious and rather classic office with dark wood trim, large and soft leather sofas, tables, cabinets with books. Of course, there was also a large desk, behind which sat an elderly stately lady in white clothes and a robe, with fine bluish patterns running along the edges. Her grey hair was gathered in a tight French twist, and her gaze was incredibly alive and sharp. "Ah, Delphine, my girl," the lady smiled cheerfully, stood up from the table, and moved toward us. "Grand Master," Delphine bowed respectfully, and the lady quickly put her hands on her shoulders and returned her to an upright position. "Leave these formalities. Is this your student?" The lady looked at me carefully and quickly. "Yes," nodded Delphine. "Maximilian Knight." This elderly lady came a little closer, and I politely bowed. It seemed that she saw something in me that only she knew, and she nodded sparingly but with satisfaction. "Patricia Hart, Grand Master of Transfiguration and Alchemy," she introduced herself, and many interesting works on her behalf immediately flashed through my mind, some dating from the mid-19th century. "I am honored to be introduced to such a distinguished expert in my field," I bowed respectfully again. The Grand Master nodded, taking the information for granted, and turned to Delphine. "You must hurry if you are confident in your abilities. The Council may at any moment set aside squabbles and approve the new order of certification." The Grand Master headed straight into the wall with a confident step, as did Delphine. I had to put aside my questions and quickly get next to them. Before I reached the wall, I felt the fluctuations of magic from the Grand Master, and the space around us seemed to blur. It was just for a brief moment, but it was enough for us to take the next step in a completely different room. A spacious hall like an amphitheater. We were standing on a large round patch of the smooth yellow stone floor. It was as smooth as it seemed possible at all. At the edge of this space, massive wooden tables stood in a crescent. Those in the middle were somewhat more massive, and those that radiated from the center on the sides in the shape of a crescent were clearly intended for visitors. The lighting was unique, I would say, because all that was visible to me was the round patch of floor and the rows of tables in front of me. Everything else, if it was there at all, was drowned in darkness without drawing attention to itself. Grand Master Hart headed toward these central tables, near which 7 wizards in black, dark blue, and white robes were standing, apparently arguing about something, gesticulating vigorously, and, judging by the emotions on some of their faces, there was an active discussion about whose bloodline the goats and pigs were in, and about the negative effect such a kinship had on the intellectual abilities of their opponents. "Stay here, don't go anywhere. We're about to start," Delphine said briefly and headed upstairs to her colleagues. It took about a minute for the venerable wizards to stop their argument and settle into their seats at the large tables, looking up at me. Grand Master Hart sat in the very middle and was clearly in charge of the gathering. "Ladies and gentlemen," she spoke. "As the chairperson of the 21st Attestation Commission for the title of Master in the field of Transfiguration, I declare the beginning of the 7th meeting to confirm the qualifications of the applicant open. Master Delphine Gabriella Greengrass, as a mentor to the applicant, has the right to debate. She is deprived of the final vote. Let's get started." The Grand Master swept her hand over her desk, and judging by the magic, something definitely happened there, but what was unknown. Colleagues stared at their desks. Perhaps some information had appeared there. "Applicant," the Grand Master spoke again, looking at me. "Introduce yourself." I had read the minutes of the meetings, even though all the secret information there was deleted, as well as the rules, so I had no questions about what was going on. "Maximilian Knight of the Black Family, 15 full years old. A student of the Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, a personal disciple of Master Delphine Gabriella Greengrass." The wizards immediately whispered about something, discussing it vigorously. It only lasted a couple of seconds, and when everyone fell silent, continuing to study something on their desks, the Grand Master continued. "Due to the cancellation 2 days ago, and not having any requirements for applicants to have done research in a transfiguration at the time certification began, the question of having or not having publications is removed. However," spoke the elderly wizard, who had been arguing vigorously with his colleagues until recently, "I believe that the Commission has the right to evaluate the applicant's research in the protected discipline. Master is not just a strong wizard who has memorized a bunch of spells. I think we all want to know if the applicant can contribute to the difficult and so multifaceted field of the study of magic. Chapter 353. Many nodded approvingly, and the Grand Master looked at me. Mr. Knight, can you provide any scientific research for consideration by the Commission? Certainly, Chairperson, I nodded. Taking my wand from the holster on my forearm, I began to transfigure 2 parchments out of thin air. Then, not without Rowena's help, creating on them in parallel systematic, orderly notes on my experiments with transfiguring myself into an alloy of living and non-living based on knowledge of the properties of materials, but not indicating that I transfigured myself, just an object, a person, a wizard. The second scroll was filled with general calculations on the transfiguration of space, something like an architect. The scrolls became longer and longer, the notes stretched further and further, periodically replaced by calculations and diagrams. As soon as the creation of the scrolls came to an end, I used magic to divide them into many equal-sized pages and filed them like a notebook, levitating them on the table in front of the Commission. Did I surprise these wizards with something like this? Not at all. I even somehow felt better from the fact that I am for once among wizards who do not fall into a state of shock at the sight of something more than a couple of glowing rays of spells. The members of the Commission quickly ran their eyes over the text, flipped through the notes, whispered among themselves, after which the same old debater spoke. There is indeed material, and after a cursory reading, I think everyone will agree that we can proceed directly to the certification. However, the material requires, in my opinion, a more detailed study. Vote. Who is in favor of conducting the certification with the subsequent study of the materials provided? The vote, oddly enough, was all in favor. Unanimously. Maximilian Knight. Let's get down to the theoretical part. You can sit down. The problem is, there's nothing to sit on, but we're at the transfiguration certification, aren't we? I waved my wand in front of me and twisted a simple loop to make it easier to control the flow of magic, created a simple and comfortable chair and table out of thin air, and sat down at it, which caused a slight smile on the faces of some of the Commission members. Let's get started, the Grand Master indicated. Questions, questions, questions. For several hours they tried to get my soul out of me through some rather unusual questions in the field of transfiguration. It is good that due to the provided works, I managed to avoid banal and simple topics, and no one checked my basic knowledge at all. However, there were plenty of other topics, ranging from the nuances of transfiguration from non-living to living and the like, to the dependence of arithmetic formulas on the volume, density, and structural diversity of the source material, and their impact on the cost of magical energy and the dependence of these costs on the accuracy of arithmetic or schematic representation of the final transformation product. The topic of space transfiguration, its features and differences with the transfiguration of the matter was also touched upon. But in addition to the banal complexity of the questions and topics raised, there was also one moment that prompted me to one interesting idea: energy transfiguration. As I answered the questions, I had to think about these very answers, process the available information, sometimes looking at it from a completely different angle. This is what gave me the idea of energy transfiguration. The idea appeared at the moment when I had to compare some general rules and formulas for the transfiguration of space and the transfiguration of matter. If you complicate them as much as possible, making them as detailed as possible, not without the help of Rowena, of course, then similar mathematical structures and justifications begin to be traced. On top of this came the theory that all things are energy. Then from the depths of consciousness, like a jack-in-the-box, jumped out string theory, which I remember, to my great regret, very, very badly. All this gave rise to a chain of completely abstract theories and thoughts in my head that transfiguration is something much deeper than the transformation of one into another. However, all this mess has not yet been able to take shape into something meaningful. Not yet. After the theoretical part, I ran through practice, being asked to transfigure everything into everything. The amount of this transfiguration was really impressive: 12 cubic meters of stone as starter material, and the time to create and activate a spell was given almost in line with my capabilities. Of course, if it was necessary, I would immediately strengthen myself with hemomancy or add a little of this energy to compensate for the lack of magic, but I didn't have to do this. As a final chord in my practice certification, I was asked to perform a series of transfigurations based on the materials I had provided. Well, I turned myself into that funny, in my opinion, panther made of an alloy of organic and inorganic, all the insides and appearances of which were covered with runes for various magical manipulations. I also reproduced the transfiguration of the shadow through space, creating objects from the shadow. Not much at all, within a quarter of a cubic meter in volume. It is too difficult in the form of a spell, though not very costly in terms of magic. This is not an absorbed architect who has become an ability. Such a transfiguration pleased one part of the commission and slightly upset the other, but it is understandable the guild may be one, but people are people. Not everyone will be pleased with the success of another master's apprentice. Chapter 354. At the end of the practical part of the attestation, Grandmaster Hart decided that a more detailed examination of the materials provided was required. The commission would make a final decision within 8 hours. I left the hall with Delphine through the door that suddenly appeared behind me. We again walked along the high stone corridors with columns, pots with trees, and even sometimes we came across huge paintings, but, as in many other corridors, it was still impossible to see what kind of images and frescoes on the ceiling were there. Yet, every now and then, the eye itself rushes to them. Master, what is painted on the ceiling? No one knows. Look, Delphine waved her hand, sending a ball of lumos up to the ceiling. I wish I could say that the farther the ball flew, the more light fell on the ceiling, but no. It seemed as if lumos was flying into the void. Everything was black under the ceiling, and only faint vague images and silhouettes flashed. So everything remained. The lumos went out, and Delphine spoke. It is said that on these ceilings is hidden all the mystery of the universe and that only those who have comprehended and mastered the mysteries of transfiguration and alchemy can see and comprehend it. So has someone read it? Even if they did, smiled Delphine, they probably took that mystery to their grave. Science and knowledge are strange things. The answer to one question generates two new ones, like the heads of a hydra, and this battle knows no end. Or maybe someone has enchanted everything out of boredom. I shrugged, and Delphine laughed. That's even more likely. So, we have up to 8 hours of time, and they can call us at any time. But we should not leave the city, and even more so the country. Excursion. I'm all for it. It took us about 20 minutes to leave the dungeons, but we didn't leave exactly through the church, but from a door in the next building. From the feel of it, there were some very serious and complex spells of concealment from ordinary people and just curious wizards. If you know what to look for and where to look, you'll find it. From the very first seconds of the walk, I was captured by the atmosphere of this wonderful city. Narrow stone-paved streets or large squares, houses in a variety of architectural styles. The design was created following the fashion trends of different eras. Of course, many things were repeatedly restored or transferred, rebuilt over the years, but the atmosphere remained amazing. Especially pleasant, as for me, was the time of year and a slightly cloudy autumn sky. The yellowed or fallen leaves gave the air that characteristic smell of autumn, which I had not felt for a long time in the forests of Scotland near Hogwarts. There were not many people on the street because it was not the tourist season at all. That's what made it possible to walk freely and quietly through the streets of the city. But the most amazing thing was that I could feel the magic everywhere, to varying degrees. It was especially well felt near really old houses, medieval structures, whether it was the Powder Tower, the astronomical clock, or, most surprisingly, the Strahov Monastery. We didn't get to it right away, though we didn't go inside. Here, Delphine nodded toward the monastery as we passed close by. Of course, as it should be, Delphine kept her hand on the crook of my elbow all the way, skillfully directing our route to where she needed it. One of the most extraordinary libraries is located. At the moment, there are two sections, general and closed. The closed one contains a lot of early printed or handwritten works on alchemy and other magic. Of course, by arrangement with the relevant organizations, including Ouroboros. Isn't that heresy? Yes and no, Delphine smiled, and we walked on, descending away from the monastery. There are magic and rituals that can be performed without having a crumb of ability and being an ordinary person. Such manipulations take magic from the outside. There are very few of them, and they are completely forbidden for spreading and even familiarization among ordinary people. The rest, both church and wizards, value as legacies of former times. Wizards value knowledge, not its bearer, and therefore copies of all books are available in abundance. Still, the originals are under the spell of preservation, and Muggle systems of the same purpose are stored here. However, as I know, not every ordinary person can get into a closed section, even though it's set up more like a museum now. Chapter 355. Soon we were again closer to the center of Prague, and it was already getting late in the evening. The somewhat prolonged journey and walking affected us quite obviously, and now we found ourselves in a small patio, a kind of courtyard at a restaurant, although in this case, a large and expensive café. There were very few visitors both inside and outside, and the time of year was chilly by local standards, but how can you frighten an Englishman with a slight chill and gradually clearing evening sky? I would like to understand at least a little bit in Czech, because the quarter chosen for a walk clearly did not imply the presence of tourists here, and there were no duplicate inscriptions in English, like the menu in the café, here. So after I pulled back a chair for Delphine and sat across from her, to my slight embarrassment, she was the one who had to deal with the order. I'm a little surprised, Mentor, I smiled as we waited for the order. The night lights were already turning on in the streets, though the almost clear sky still gave off a blueness that changed to redness at sunset. What exactly are you surprised about? You know the Czech language, and, apparently, you know how to handle ordinary money. You are guided in the city of ordinary people. You know, dealing with our pure-blood wizards sometimes assures me of the impossibility of what I see now. Delphine smiled, fixing the thick braid of hair on her shoulder. Somehow, it so happened that I am trained to read and count, and I dare to hope that I have no lack of intelligence. And when you travel around the world, the skill of orientation in cities comes one way or another. And what's more, I can somehow distinguish between a café, an atelier, and a library. Don't get me wrong. Don't worry, Delphine said. I myself have repeatedly fallen into a stupor, seeing the inability of many wizards to simply navigate in 3 buildings or cross the road. There are things, the understanding of which is not taught, and it comes only in the course of long observations and subconscious analysis of regularity. For example, have you noticed that in England, people in the ordinary world, without noticing it, try to walk on the left side of the road, and in other countries, on the right? That's true. And it's simple, in England, cars drive on the left side, and in other countries, except Japan, if I'm not mistaken, on the right side. There is no such thing in principle in the magical world, and everyone walks where it is convenient. But many of the everyday regularity and things are the same for both worlds because we were divided not so long ago, and those who remember times without the statute are still alive. The same cafes, libraries, publishing houses, specialty stores, etc., all have the same idea and concept, except the stuffing is different. The waiter brought us our order, and we slowly began our meal, during which we remained silent, enjoying the local cuisine. Only when it was time for drinks and quiet time, and the sky overhead had finally darkened, giving way to electric but soft light, did we continue our conversation. And how, by the way, will the commission notify us to return? Patroness or golem? Delphine shrugged. Speaking of golems, since we're in Prague. Did you know that this name for artificially created pseudo-intelligent objects owes its origins to Prague? Honestly no. Then you should definitely read both the legends of ordinary people and specific literature on transfiguration. It's not like we touched on golem building in detail, just the general basics and tenets. In general, in transfiguration, no one is particularly surprised to create something intelligent, but everything uses one or another pattern from the wizard's mind. The same statues at Hogwarts. Ancient design, but essentially no golem there, just a transformation and enchantment with a pattern of behavior and commands. We sipped juice from our glasses, after which Delphine continued. And it was here in Prague that a famous thinker and master, not so much in transfiguration, as in the Kabbalah relevant at that time, was able to create a semblance of the soul and mind, enclosing it in a clay man. In Kabbalah, a long time ago, they tried to realize the legend according to which God created a man from clay, giving him a soul. This was implemented in the 16th century by Jude Law. It was his work, almost 100 years later, that gave rise to golem building. And the very word golem was taken by wizards to commemorate the origin of Jude Law. Funny, by the way, that one of the forms of this word, golem, means clumsy idol, dummy. Even so golem haha. Delphine smiled, too, realizing what I was getting at. In this light, I spoke through a smile, one surname we know is seen in a very different light. And most importantly, right in the bullseye. As you name the boat, Delphine shrugged, continuing to smile, so it will float. As soon as we paid up and left the hospitable establishment, a tiny bird landed on Delphine's shoulder, dropping an equally tiny note in her hands and immediately flying away. Without any wands, Lady Greengrass enlarged the note and glanced at me as she read it. It's time.
That is all for today. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this journey, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell. If you have any suggestions or feedback for me, please drop a comment down below.